I'd mentioned in the introductory course to this entire learning path that Microsoft's breakdown of the objectives and tasks between the 70-410 and the 70-411 is a bit, well, curious. When you take a look at what Microsoft wants you to know, the 411 just appears to be in many ways kind of a part two of the 410 content. And so back when you were preparing for 70-410, there was a lot of stuff here in 411 that you kind of almost had to know in order to bring some context to what you needed to know for the 410. Well, that is odd, but it's also kind of good because here in this course titled Configure Active Directory, we have a functional group full of different tasks that in many ways are things you may have already seen before. Now here in this course, and for the functional group on configuring Active Directory, there's a surprisingly small amount of actual Active Directory configuring that goes on. Rather, you'll find that we'll spend a lot of time here talking about things like passwords and password policies, how to set up service accounts and the variety of different kinds of service accounts, how to manage your domain controllers and create things like read-only domain controllers, and some other minor tasks like backups and recovery. Now, not minor from the perspective of unnecessary, but minor from the perspective of just how often you might need to touch these things in your everyday administration. Now, if you are just joining us, this is actually the fourth in a series of 7 different courses that make up our learning path for the 70-411 exam. And that learning path began with an introductory course, just a real quick intro to the MCSA and the 70-411 content. Everything we're talking about here has to do with Windows Server 2012 R2 and the new and updated functional groups, objectives, and tasks associated with that R2 release of the exam. We then took a look at deploying, managing, and maintaining servers, a whole course and functional group associated with that, as well as a look at configuring network services and access. With those servers up and operational, with them built, with our clients now able to connect to them via DNS or remotely, we can now take a look at how to configure and manage our Active Directory and all those curious configurations that I'd spoke of a second ago. Now, as before, here in this course, we have 4 different modules to look at, each of which tags to one of the objectives for the exam, the first 2 of which have to do with configuring and managing accounts. So we'll talk first about configuring account policies, which here really corresponds to password policies and the various ways in which you can configure the password experience for users. Now, not all accounts are user accounts. Some accounts are service accounts. Now, in the past, service accounts have been kind of a pain in the neck, in part because of the exact passwords that we talked about in that first module. Well, Microsoft brings to bear some newer technologies, some newer features that kind of ease the process of dealing with these service accounts. And so we'll talk here in this second module about how you can bring these new technologies and features to bear in order to just ease the process of dealing with those service accounts that power your everyday applications and services. From there, we'll switch gears and talk about the configuration of domain controllers and then the maintenance of Active Directory itself. That first topic there on configuring domain controllers has a couple of really small things that we'll be discussing. And in fact, we'll talk about the transfer and seizure of operations master roles, which are just a couple of commands that you need to know. We'll talk about installing and configuring a read-only domain controller, which is an altogether unexciting experience. But I'll talk more about exactly why and where you would implement an RODC as opposed to a full DC. And also the new topic of configuring domain controller cloning, which was something back in the old days you really should never do. Thankfully, here in Windows Server 2012 R2, there is some new technology that's brought to bear to support the virtual machine cloning of a domain controller in a way that will protect your Active Directory from corruption. If you are in any way using snapshots in your virtual environment, I would definitely take a look at this third task because there's a couple of gotchas having to do with cloning your domain controllers. That last one down there on maintaining Active Directory is all about backup and recovery. All the things you need to know from the object level to the container level, all the way to Active Directory itself for how to back it up and how to recover it should a corruption occur. So this is our course, number 4 in our series here, and somewhere around or approaching the halfway point in the topics we need to know for the 70-411 exam. Coming up next, we will begin with a look at account policies. And as I said, this has everything to do with passwords and password policy settings. We'll talk about how to configure password policies, how to configure things when you need multiple different kinds of password policies, one for one kind of user and one for a completely different class of user, how to delegate password settings management, and also how to configure some of the Kerberos settings you may need in order to provide the kinds of security your environment requires. All of that and more is the topic for our next module coming up.